A man with everything wealth, power, reputation was walking alone through a silent, snow-covered park. For 7 years, his life had been frozen by grief, a routine built on memories of what he had lost. But on this night, the silence shattered. A small voice, fragile yet piercing, whispered, "Mommy, please don't die." He turned, and in that moment, the world he thought he knew began to crumble. A little girl stood barefoot in the snow beside her unconscious mother, her eyes filled with fear, yet burning with a plea no one could ignore. For the first time in years, his choices weren't about business or success. They were about life, about love, about stepping into a story he never expected. Stay with us as we uncover how one desperate cry reshaped a man's destiny. And don't forget to subscribe to The Retold Stories for more unforgettable journeys of hope and healing. The night was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skin, where even the crunch of footsteps feels like an intrusion. Snow drifted gently beneath the faint glow of amber lamplight, each flake catching the air as if it had nowhere urgent to fall. Daniel Whitmore moved through that quiet, a tall man wrapped in a heavy coat, his leather shoes marking the path he had walked every year on this night. For 7 long years, he had returned here, to this winding park, carrying the same weight in his chest. It was the anniversary of his wife's death, a ritual he never spoke about, not to his board of directors, not to his colleagues, not even to the friends who had slowly drifted away. This place was his sanctuary, a hidden corner of the city where grief was allowed to breathe. He liked that the world seemed far away here. The skyscrapers, the noise, the endless calls that defined his days. In this place, only the wind and the whisper of snow kept him company, and perhaps, in that solitude, he could admit what he never confessed aloud, that all his success, his empire, his wealth, meant nothing against the emptiness waiting for him at home. Tonight felt heavier than most. The storm carried a strange beauty, its relentless fall echoing the stillness inside him. From the outside, Daniel Whitmore looked untouchable, a man of staggering fortune, owner of penthouses with glass walls stretching toward the skyline, a calendar filled with investors and impossible deals. People saw him as a man who could bend the world to his will, but inside, he was winter incarnate, frozen, brittle, endless. He was halfway down the dimly lit path when something pierced through the hush. At first it was so faint he thought he had imagined it, like the wind teasing the bare branches. Then it came again, sharper, fragile but desperate. "Mommy, please don't die." Daniel stopped. His breath clouded in front of him as he turned toward the voice. Just beyond the bend, beneath a flickering lamp, he saw them. A woman lay collapsed in the snow, her hair tangled with frost, her lips tinged blue. Beside her, a little girl knelt barefoot in the drift, a torn red coat wrapped around her tiny frame. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, her knees pressed into the frozen ground, her shoulders shaking, not from tears, but from the cold that was seeping into her bones. For a moment, Daniel could not move. He had spent years surrounded by negotiations, demands, and favors, people always wanting something from him, but never like this. Never with the raw, unfiltered honesty of a child's plea for her mother's life. The weight of his coat suddenly felt obscene, the warmth of his gloves, a reminder of the vast divide between his world and hers. His fortune had raised towers, but it had never reached into the snow to save anyone. Finally, he moved toward them. His footsteps crunched loudly, startling in the silence. The girl turned, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes locking onto his. She didn't beg. She didn't hesitate. She simply said, "You're rich, right? Please help my mom." The words carved into him like ice. He knelt in front of her, lowering himself until he was at her level. Her lips were pale, her breath unsteady. Without speaking, he pulled off his overcoat and wrapped it around her shivering body, tucking it close. The girl didn't resist. She simply watched him with eyes far too old for her age, the eyes of someone who had already learned that trust was a dangerous gamble. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Mia," she whispered. Her gaze flicked back to the woman lying still in the snow. "That's my mommy, Lydia." Daniel's eyes followed hers. He saw the stillness in Lydia's body, the frightening blue at her lips, the fragility of life teetering on the edge. Urgency shot through him. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing emergency services with the kind of brisk control he used in corporate crises. But this was no boardroom. This was raw, human, immediate. The wind whipped around them, scattering snowflakes across their faces. Daniel shifted closer, shielding Mia as best he could. The girl leaned into him slightly, her small hands clutching the edge of his coat as though it were the only solid thing in the world. Somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of sirens broke through the night. Daniel looked down at her, feeling something unfamiliar stir within him, a sharp crack, like ice splitting under pressure. The sirens grew louder, the snow swirled harder, but he didn't move from their side, not until the paramedics arrived. Not until he was certain that this little girl would not be left alone in the cold. And when the ambulance doors closed behind him, sealing out the storm, he realized his life had already veered onto a path he could never have predicted. Inside the ambulance, chaos unfolded. Bright lights, clipped voices, the metallic tang of antiseptic. Paramedics moved swiftly over Lydia's fragile body, adjusting oxygen masks, starting IVs. Daniel sat rigid in the corner, his expensive suit and polished shoes absurd against the stark steel walls. His reflection in the glass panel looked foreign to him, a man dressed for control in a place where control meant nothing. Across from him, Mia huddled in his coat, the fabric nearly swallowing her small frame. Her eyes never left her mother. Without hesitation, she reached out and placed her tiny hand over Lydia's, as though that touch alone could tether her to life. The steadiness in her face broke Daniel's heart. Children weren't supposed to carry that kind of composure. It was the sort of strength he admired in business, but here it felt devastating. When the ambulance jolted over ice, Mia let out the faintest whimper. Daniel leaned forward instinctively. "She's going to be okay," he murmured. He wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. Mia only nodded, her gaze locked on Lydia. By the time they reached the hospital, Daniel knew something had shifted irreversibly inside him. He had stepped into this moment as a stranger. But walking away, he realized, was no longer an option. The emergency room was a storm of fluorescent lights and hurried footsteps, a stark contrast to the muffled quiet of the snowy park. Daniel stood at the admitting desk, his posture rigid in a place that felt entirely foreign to him. The nurse's tired eyes glanced at Lydia's chart, her voice brisk as she rattled off medical terms: hypothermia, malnutrition, dehydration. She asked for insurance, for an address, for answers Daniel didn't have. Before he could stumble through a response, the little girl spoke with astonishing calm. "We don't have a house," Mia said simply. Her words fell into the sterile air like stones in water, sending ripples through Daniel's carefully constructed composure. Something inside him shifted. Without another thought, he reached for the clipboard. His pen moved swiftly, filling in his own details, his name, his contact information. "Put all charges under me," he said, his voice firm in the way it always was when ending boardroom debates. But this wasn't about winning. This was about refusing to let a child slip through the cracks of indifference. Later, as they waited in the sterile chairs of the hospital lobby, Mia's small hand curled around his. She didn't speak, but the grip said enough. Daniel looked down at her and realized with startling clarity he wasn't going anywhere. The following morning should have seen him in his office, overseeing meetings, signing contracts worth millions. Instead, he returned to the pediatric ward. He told himself it was just to check in, to reassure himself the girl was all right. But when he walked in and saw her sitting cross-legged with a coloring book spread across her lap, every stroke of crayon deliberate, he knew this wasn't something he could walk away from. A woman from Child Protective Services stood nearby, clipboard in hand, explaining that Mia might need to be placed in temporary foster care. Mia didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply walked to Daniel, took hold of his sleeve, and said with quiet certainty, "If you leave, we won't have anyone ever again." Those words broke something open in him. That same day, he signed papers granting him temporary guardianship, a role he had never imagined, yet one that suddenly felt inevitable. When he unlocked the door to a corporate apartment later that week, The space looked immaculate, untouched. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, the air faint with polish. It wasn't a home. It was a showroom. Mia stood in the doorway, clutching the strap of her backpack, her wide eyes scanning the room as if afraid she might break something. "You can explore," Daniel told her, setting down groceries. "It's yours now." She hesitated, then touched the edge of the couch with her fingertips. "For both of us?" she asked softly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "For you and your mom when she comes home." In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. The sterile apartment began to soften. Groceries filled the fridge. Extra blankets appeared on the bed. Mia taped one of her crayon drawings, a bright sun over a crooked little house, onto the refrigerator. The scent of chamomile tea replaced the sterile smell of polish. At the dining table, takeout containers turned into shared meals. Laughter began to echo faintly through the once quiet rooms. One afternoon, Daniel found himself on the floor surrounded by cardboard boxes. Mia wanted a castle, complete with turrets and a drawbridge. His assistant had scheduled him for an investor lunch, but he canceled without hesitation. For hours, he cut, taped, and built alongside a little girl whose giggles filled corners of his heart he thought had long been sealed shut. By evening, the cardboard castle stood proudly in the living room, decorated with stickers and flags. Mia insisted they take a photo to show her mother. That night, when they brought the picture to Lydia at the hospital, Daniel saw something he hadn't seen in years: her smile. It wasn't weak or uncertain. It was full, warm, alive. Watching Mia climb onto the bed, showing her mother every detail, Daniel realized he was smiling too. Over the next days, a quiet rhythm emerged. Mornings with coffee for him and hot cocoa for Mia. Afternoons at the hospital, where Lydia grew stronger, her cheeks returning color. Evenings spent at the apartment, drawing, reading, or sharing meals that were simple but filled with a new sense of belonging. It was in one of those quiet moments that Mia handed Daniel a drawing. 3 stick figures under a bright sun, one tall, one medium, one small. Above them, in careful block letters, she had written, "Our family." The words hit Daniel like a wave. For years he had walked through life, insulated by grief, convinced nothing could melt the ice that had settled in his heart. But here, in a child's drawing, was the truth he hadn't dared to hope for. He wasn't just helping. He was becoming part of something he thought he'd lost forever. And when Lydia looked at him later, her voice soft but unwavering, "She's right, you know. You are part of this." He understood. Trust wasn't something you negotiated. It was something you lived. That night, he pinned Mia's drawing to the refrigerator beside the photo of their cardboard castle. For the first time in years, the walls around him didn't feel cold. They felt alive. They felt claimed. Daniel Whitmore, the man who once walked through the snow alone to remember what he had lost, was beginning to discover something even greater: what it meant to be found. The knock on the door came early, sharp, and deliberate. Daniel had grown accustomed to mornings that started quietly, with the faint scratch of crayons on paper as Mia sat at the table while he brewed coffee. But this morning, the rhythm broke. 3 raps, steady and purposeful, echoed through the apartment. When he opened the door, a woman stood there, with a clipboard and a cautious smile. Her badge from Child Services gleamed in the hall light. Angela Rivera introduced herself and stepped inside. Her voice was calm but carried an edge as she explained. A distant relative had come forward, claiming blood ties to Mia and petitioning for custody. The words landed like ice in Daniel's chest. Stable environment, that was the phrase Angela used. The kind of phrase that sounded logical in courtrooms, but meant nothing in the heart of a little girl who had already lost too much. Mia peeked around the corner, crayon still in hand. "Who's that?" she asked softly. Daniel's voice was steady. "She's just here to check on you." Angela smiled kindly at the child, but when she left, the air in the apartment felt heavier. Daniel stood by the door, staring into the hallway long after it closed. Mia sat cross-legged at the table, coloring a picture of a tall building with 3 figures in front, the word "home" written above it. When she looked up at him, her eyes asked the question. She didn't speak. He walked over, placed a hand gently on the back of her chair and said, "No one is taking you away. I promise." That afternoon, he sat at Lydia's bedside, waiting until Mia stepped out to fetch a snack. Only then did he explain. "A relative has surfaced. They're trying to take her." Lydia's face went pale, her hand tightening around the blanket. "They'll take her from me," she whispered. Daniel leaned forward, his hand firm around hers. "Then we fight, together." For the first time since meeting her, Lydia let silence stretch between them without fear. There was trust there, fragile but real. The fight began that evening. Daniel called Claire Morrison, an attorney he trusted. Claire was sharp, unshakable, the kind of person who could dismantle arguments with quiet precision. Over the phone, she explained what they would need: documentation of Mia's care, medical reports, witness statements, evidence that Daniel and Lydia had created a stable, nurturing environment. Daniel also made calls of his own, to doctors and nurses who had seen his devotion firsthand, to contacts who could dig into the so-called relative's questionable history. Every call was a declaration: "I am not walking away." Days blurred into preparation. Mia noticed, of course. She noticed the late-night papers spread across the table, the phone calls taken in hushed tones. One evening, she simply climbed onto the couch beside him and handed him a drawing. 3 figures holding hands, standing in front of a courthouse. Above them, she wrote, "Together." Daniel's throat tightened as he pinned it to the refrigerator. The apartment walls now carried more color than they ever had in his penthouse. They were becoming a record of a life, a family, a fight worth waging. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse loomed against the winter sky, its stone steps slick with ice. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and polished wood, a place where decisions carried the weight of permanence. Daniel and Lydia sat side by side, Mia nearby, with a hospital volunteer. Across the aisle, the petitioner sat with her lawyer, eyes sharp and calculating. The proceedings were tense. The petitioner's lawyer painted a picture of instability. Lydia's illness, their lack of a permanent residence before Daniel's involvement, the supposed advantages of a more traditional home. Lydia's hand tightened under the table, but Daniel gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze. When it was their turn, Claire stood with measured confidence. She presented photographs of Mia in warm clothes, drawings taped proudly to apartment walls, medical records showing Lydia's steady recovery, and testimony from doctors and nurses. Witness after witness confirmed what the evidence already showed. Mia was safe, loved, and thriving. Then Lydia took the stand. Her voice was quiet, but resolute. She spoke of fighting for her daughter every single day, of refusing to give up even when survival felt impossible. When her voice trembled, she steadied herself with one truth: "My daughter is my reason. Without her, I am nothing." Finally, Daniel testified. He described the night he met Mia, barefoot in the snow, begging for her mother's life. He spoke of how that moment split something open inside him, how every day since had been about showing up, not out of obligation, but out of love. "She is not unstable," he said firmly. "She is unshakable, and I will stand beside her for as long as it takes to make sure Mia grows up safe and loved." Angela Rivera, the social worker, gave her final testimony. Her investigation revealed troubling gaps in the petitioner's history: unstable housing, inconsistent employment, questionable associations. "In my professional opinion," she concluded, "Mia is best served by remaining with her mother under the current care arrangement with Mr. Whitmore." The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand, listened silently. The room held its breath as she set down her pen. "Custody will remain with Lydia Harper," she declared. "And the court recognizes Mr. Whitmore as the child's legal stepfather." The words felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Lydia sagged with relief. Daniel's hand trembled in hers. Across the room, Mia clapped her small hands together and rushed into her mother's embrace. Outside, the cold air bit at their faces, but it felt lighter somehow. Reporters waited, with cameras and questions. "Why involve yourself this deeply, Mr. Whitmore? You're a CEO. You could have written a check and walked away." Daniel met their gaze, his voice calm, steady. "Because family isn't about blood. It's about showing up." Later, in the quiet of the car, he turned to Lydia. "What would you think?" he asked softly. about making this permanent?" Her eyes widened, then softened. She didn't answer in words. She didn't need to. The warmth in her gaze was enough. That spring, in the very park where Daniel once walked alone in grief, they stood beneath budding trees and exchanged vows. Guests gathered not as witnesses to wealth or spectacle, but to love born from snow and silence. Mia scattered petals down the path with solemn determination, the same way she once whispered for help on a freezing night. Daniel promised not only to be Lydia's partner, but the father Mia already saw when she reached for his hand. Lydia promised not to be fixed, but to keep building a life together, brick by brick, kindness by kindness. When the rings were placed on their fingers, when Mia flung the last of her petals into the air, when applause rippled like a warm breeze, Daniel felt the ice inside him melt for good. This wasn't about rescue anymore. It was about family, about belonging, about never letting go. There are stories that begin with wealth, with power, with a man who seems to have everything. And there are stories that begin with loss, with a woman who has fought too long, with a child who has already carried too much. This story was all of those at once. Daniel Whitmore walked into that snowy night as a man frozen in grief, a man who believed the world had already taken everything from him. But a single voice, a child's desperate whisper in the cold, broke open the silence he thought was permanent. "Mommy, please don't die." Those words carried him to a woman on the edge of life, and a little girl, holding on to hope with hands too small and too steady. What followed was not a miracle born of wealth, but of presence. It was the simple act of not walking away, sitting in hospital chairs through long nights, filling an empty apartment with drawings and cardboard castles, signing papers that carried more weight than any corporate contract ever could, showing up again and again until the ordinary became extraordinary. There were battles, legal fights, fears of losing what they had just begun to build. But every challenge revealed something truer than success. That family is not measured in bloodlines, but in the willingness to stand beside each other, to say, "I will not let you go." In the end, Daniel found not just a child to protect or a woman to love, but a family that healed the coldest parts of his soul. Lydia found strength in knowing she was not alone. And Mia, the little girl who once whispered into the snow, found her voice answered not with silence, but with love that promised to stay. This is more than a story about survival. It is about the power of small choices, one coat wrapped around shaking shoulders, one drawing pinned to a refrigerator, one promise made in a quiet room. It is proof that compassion can turn strangers into family, that presence can rebuild what grief tried to destroy, and that love can bloom even in the harshest winter. And as their story reminds us, the truest wealth is not measured in glass towers or overflowing accounts, but in the warmth of belonging, in the certainty that when you reach for a hand, someone is there. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that kindness is never wasted and love is never too late. And if you believe in the power of stories to heal, to inspire, and to remind us of what truly matters, then this is only the beginning. Subscribe to the Retold Stories today and join us for more journeys of hope, resilience, and the kind of love that changes lives. Because sometimes the stories we share are the very ones that show us how to live.